Good morning. My name is Nancy Neighbors, and I am the Director of Regional Enhancement at the Knoxville Chamber. We are grateful to have you with us this morning as we discuss the importance of accessibility. Before we get started, I want to thank our Regional Enhancement sponsor, PMG Benefits Higginbotham, and our infrastructure ecosystem sponsors, Axe Fleet Maintenance, Cook Brothers Homes, Fraley and Schilling, and Smart Bank for making today's program possible. At this time, I would like to ask each of our panelists to give a brief introduction. Please tell us who you are, where you work, and how your work engages with the accessibility space. Stephanie, we can start with you.
Thank you, Nancy. My name is Stephanie Cook, and I am with the City of Knoxville. I'm the Americans with Disabilities Act coordinator, and I have been with the city since 1998. And my work engages with the accessibility space in many, many ways. Part of my responsibilities are to ensure that city facilities and programs and policies are accessible to and inclusive of individuals with disabilities. And I also hear from business owners or sometimes clients or customers of particular businesses when they encounter a request or a concern about accessibility, or if they want to file a complaint about accessibility. So I'm all in when it comes to accessibility for people with disabilities, and I am thankful to be invited to be here today.
Glad to have you. Brandon?
Sure. My name is Brandon Morrow. I'm an employment lawyer with Kramer, Rayson, LLP here in Knoxville. I've been an employment lawyer for over a decade at this point, and a lot of my work centers around working with employers as they work through the interactive process with their employees to reach accommodations for those employees. A lot of my work is kind of what I would call preventative maintenance, working with my clients to make sure that they can avoid any ADA issues or any types of employment issues. And then, if unfortunately there is ultimately litigation that arises out of something, I also represent my clients before courts and administrative agencies. So that's kind of the scope of my practice, and certainly appreciate the chamber for having me on this morning.
Yeah, we appreciate you being here. Gavin?
Good morning. I'm Gavin. I'm the president of Baker Marketing, and we are a full-service marketing agency, which includes websites. And so that's what we're going to be here to cover today, is how are websites needing to be ADA compliant, and potentially where are the pieces of a website really beginning to impact users, and how changes are really coming down the pike that will affect businesses and then other kind of public agencies. So our clients are across industry, and so we're excited to be here to talk through what you could do today and what you need to know about for the future.
Okay. Gavin, we're excited to hear about that. I didn't know there was ADA compliance on websites, and what all of you are going to share with us is going to be very interesting. I want to thank our audience for being here today. Before we get started with questions for our panelists, I want to remind our attendees that they can enter any question that they have along the way in the chat, and we will answer them at the end of the program as time allows. Stephanie, I'm going to start with you. Can you give us a brief description of the Americans with Disabilities Act?
Yes, ma'am. So the ADA is federal civil rights law that was signed into law in July of 1990. It isn't the first civil rights law to impact individuals with disabilities. That would be 1973's Rehabilitation Act, Section 504 specifically, which required any recipient of federal funds to be accessible to and inclusive of individuals with disabilities. What the difference between the Rehab Act and the 1990 ADA is that when the ADA came along, it gave individuals with disabilities the opportunity to assert their rights under the ADA and to obtain or seek changes to increase accessibility and inclusion, and prohibited discrimination against individuals with disabilities. There are 5 titles or chapters. It's a huge, difficult sometimes to understand law. Title I is everything employment. Mr. Morrow is going to remind us of those requirements. Title II is state and local government and public transportation, which is where the city, the county, the state, and all public transportation providers fall. Title III is public accommodations, which is a little bit of a confusing way to say private industry or commercial industry that's open to and available to the public. Title IV is effective communication. That's where Mr. Baker will share with us some of our responsibilities to communicate effectively. And Title V is miscellaneous. That title is one that we tend to skip because it's titled miscellaneous. But it's a really important title because that is the one that sets the civil rights law aside from the Rehab Act. And it gives individuals with disabilities the legal right to pursue remedy when they find a barrier to accessibility or if they believe that they have been discriminated against due to having a disability. So big law impacts at a minimum 25% of the population. Right now, we have 61 million Americans with a form of a disability, and that does not include seniors who, at the rate of 10,000 per day, turn age 65 right now in our country. So we're experiencing a boom of sorts of people who require or will soon require good accessibility to our built environment and to our programs.
What are the most common violations that you see at retail establishments?
Well, for retail establishments, one thing I need to make very clear is when somebody contacts me as the city's ADA coordinator and says, in fact, I have a message from a couple of days ago. I went to X business, the accessible parking, you have to travel 3 times the distance to get to the door. There are no accessible grab bars in the ladies' room, etc., etc. So only thing that I can do with that is educate the person that made contact about the law and what it says and give them the tools to advocate on their own behalf. I can explain to them that there may be a way that city codes enforcement could go and check it out. And if they violated the property maintenance code, then we could suggest that they make some changes. But if there's no violation to the property maintenance code, we cannot enforce, if you will, ADA compliance upon anyone other than ourselves. So then that individual would need to go file a complaint with the company or with the Department of Justice. Some of the biggest quote violations that I see, and I'm a wheelchair user. I have been since 1987. So I fully get the need for true accessibility, but some of the biggest violations I see are that we have a physically accessible space. It was designed and built perfectly accessible, but then we add things to our space, our display areas. Sometimes just the entrance to get from the accessible parking to the accessible entrance is blocked because we want to put our wares out there. I can give you an example for like a gas station or a convenience store. Might be beautifully designed according to the ADA and is perfectly accessible. So if I get parked in an accessible space and I get up onto the sidewalk, I may or may not be able to get to the accessible entrance because oftentimes there's a trash can, there's a newspaper dispenser, there's a natural, or not natural gas, but the tanks for gas cylinders out there, ice distribution machines. So sometimes we can have an accessible space and then we can make it inaccessible, not meaning to. That is one of the bigger violations that I see.
Okay, so those sounds like easy fixes, right? Moving merchandise, moving displays, getting that space back so that it's more open. But what if a business needs more assistance meeting ADA requirements?
If they're interested and if it's the business itself that reaches out to me, I'm more than happy to share with them my treasure trove of ADA resources, and I can share with them if they have a specific concern or maybe they've gotten a complaint. my bathrooms aren't accessible, or I have 2 steps to the entrance, that sort of thing. Title III agencies, which are the private industry available to public individuals, have a duty to perform what's called readily achievable barrier removal. That obligation has been there since 1990. So say you have an older establishment, maybe you have some parking, but you don't have an accessible route to get from the accessible parking to a good entrance. Then what you are encouraged and expected to do by the Department of Justice is to gradually make these changes. It's not intended to break the bank of any business owner. In fact, there are tax credits available. I think it's $10,000 or $15,000 per year. So if a business finds that they need to improve accessibility to their establishment, and they determine, okay, we need some parking, we need a better entrance, and we need to do something in our restrooms, they could choose to do parking and then get the tax credit for that year, turn around and then do extra work for the entrance or maybe parts of the bath. I mean, they could technically spread it out over a little bit of time to give them that financial break. But if an individual decides to go straight to the Department of Justice or file a complaint or get an attorney and file a lawsuit, then that business would probably be in a position of having to make some decisions to create access sooner than later. They can still get the tax credits, but they probably wouldn't get as many tax credits because they would need to do that work kind of all at once at that point, if that makes sense.
It does.
Okay.
What do you wish more local businesses knew when it comes to accessibility?
Well, the accessibility is not difficult to achieve. Sometimes in an older facility, we may not get to achieve perfect accessibility. But if I had one thing that I would hope any business owner would be aware of is like I mentioned earlier, 25% of the population currently has a disability. So if I, as a wheelchair user, am unable to access your business or your services, then that's 25% of your potential profit that's not going to happen. And then when I go explain to my family and my friends that I couldn't shop at XYZ store, that tends to have a ripple effect. So those friends and those family members are probably also not going to shop at XYZ store. But if you make something accessible, any person, any age, any ability level can enjoy the space that you've created and be able to hopefully benefit from the goods and services that you provide.
Stephanie, thank you. You mentioned some laws. And so I'm going to move on to Brandon to address some of those. Brandon, can you give us a brief overview of employer responsibilities under ADA?
Nancy, that's a tough ask for a lawyer to give a brief overview, but I'll do my best. So the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to private employers with 15 or more employees. At the outset, it prohibits discriminating against individuals because of a disability, whether that may be a termination or any other adverse employment action. But a unique thing that the ADA does is it imposes a requirement on employers to engage in what we call the interactive process. And so once an employee makes a request for an accommodation related to their work, or if an employer is otherwise on notice that the employee has a disability that requires some sort of job accommodation, then what that means is the employer has to engage in this interactive process. It's an informal back and forth communication with the employee to really do two things. One, determine the precise limitations created by the impairment, and then ultimately explore possible reasonable accommodations that would allow that employee to perform the essential functions of their job. And so there's kind of 4 steps to that process. One, employers, and this really should be done on the front end before a request for accommodation is made, but employers should determine what the essential functions of each position are. And then once an employee makes a request for an accommodation, what the employer has to do is in communicating with that employee, determine what the limitations imposed by the disability or the impairment are. And oftentimes this is kind of the step where the employer will request an employee to provide some medical documentation, especially if the disability is not one that's readily ascertainable. And so that medical documentation will then inform the employer about the nature of the impairment. Is it temporary? Is it long term? How severe is it? And what sort of job functions does this disability really impact? Once the employer has that information, then it can, along with the employee, explore potential accommodations to allow the employee to, overcome that impairment as it relates to their job. And as employers are looking at and exploring these potential accommodations, it's not a one size fits all solution. It is very much so a case by case situation where every employee's situation is going to be somewhat different. Their job is going to be somewhat different. The employer itself, are they a big employer? Are they a small employer? All of those things come into play as employers and employees are evaluating these reasonable accommodations. And if the process works how it's supposed to, and everyone participates in good faith, then generally an accommodation can be selected that it's mutually agreeable to both parties. Now, in some rare instances, you may have a situation where it's impossible to accommodate a particular disability as it relates to a specific job. But for the most part, if you follow these steps and employers are diligent and are fairly timely about engaging in this process with employees, then you can reach a mutually agreeable solution. And one thing I would mention is while it's not necessarily required by the ADA, I encourage all of my clients to have a disability accommodation policy in their employee handbook. That's something that it gives the employee notice up front of how the employer will go through this process, how to request an accommodation, who to talk to about it, what documentation will be necessary. And that's something I generally encourage my clients to put in their policies. It's really helpful for everyone on the front end.
And what are some examples of reasonable accommodations?
Sure. It really runs the gamut. And it's going to depend on the nature of the disability. But just to give you some examples, sometimes leave can be an appropriate accommodation if you have an employee who has a disability that is finite in temporal scope. Someone who has surgery, for example, and so they have an impairment for a defined period of time, then it may be that a certain amount of leave for that employee is the appropriate type of accommodation. You have other employees who may need a modified schedule for their work. They can still do the job, but they need it to be modified, whether that's a reduction in hours or whether that is switching from day shift to night shift. There could be certain disabilities where that would be appropriate. One thing that I've seen a lot more of is requests for remote work. Individuals who may have certain sensitivities to environmental factors, whether it's they get migraines because of bright lights in the office. They may request to work remotely so that can that's something that could help them perform the essential functions of their job. They don't have to deal with the bright lights in an office. But to use an East Tennessee term, there's often more ways than one to skin a cat. And so you can look at a lot of different options. And just because an employee may initially propose an accommodation That doesn't necessarily mean that the employer has to agree to that right off the bat. There may be other middle ground accommodations that still get the job done and still allow the employee to perform the essential functions of his or her job, but it may not be the first one the employee requested. Going back to that example about, an employee who requests to work from home because of environmental factors in the office. I've seen clients that say, well, we think it's really important for you to be in the office just because of the nature of the job, but we're happy to, provide you with an office with a dimmer switch or something like that. And so there's a lot of different ways to go about this. And that's really what the interactive process is designed to do, is to keep those lines of communication open between the employer and employee. But, some of the most simple accommodations would be, if you have an employee that may have carpal tunnel syndrome, and they're doing a lot of computer work, then a simple accommodation might be some sort of modified keyboard. Anything that, small office related items can be a pretty simple fix, but a lot of the cases I deal with are a little bit more complicated than just giving somebody a different keyboard. It takes a little more. Sometimes we have to get creative about how we come up with these solutions.
And are there resources that local employers have to make those accommodations?
There are. So the first that I would mention is the Job Accommodation Network. It's I see Stephanie perhaps cheering in the background there. It's a website. You can find it at askjan.org. It is a phenomenal free resource for employers. And it is incredibly detailed and uses all sorts of different real life examples. And you can go in and really search, if I have an employee that has X disability, you can search that and even put in, the type of industry that you're in, whether it's, an office type environment or a manufacturing type environment. And then it will provide you through its, kind of database, potential accommodations for an employee. And obviously, you have to go through those and figure out as an employer what's going to work for this potential situation. But it's a great resource to give really creative ideas. I would highly recommend it. The EEOC also has some great resources that I would recommend in terms of disability accommodation. And then, finally, I would say consult your local employment lawyer. We have kind of seen the gamut of these types of requests for accommodations and can provide some pretty helpful guidance. One thing I remember being told in law school is that as lawyers, you don't get to make the facts, you just have to argue the law. And with all due respect to my great professors in law school, that's not necessarily the case for employment lawyers. If our clients get us involved early enough in the process, we can help them along the way to make sure that the decisions they're making with respect to, disability accommodations are compliant with the law and they're good for their employees. And so that's something I've tried to train my clients on over the years is, if you have a question, let's jump on this issue early and get me involved. We can walk through it and come up with a game plan.
Okay. And what are the most common cases that you've seen regarding accessibility?
Yeah. So I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier. One thing I'm seeing more and more of is requests for accommodations as they relate to remote work. That is something, we saw some of it pre-pandemic, but I think what has happened is so many employees were working remotely during the pandemic that has become a very common request for an accommodation now. And employers are in a little bit of a tough spot here, right? Because during the pandemic, if you had a workforce that was largely working from home, and now you take the position that, well, the same position is in person only, and we're not going to allow a telecommuting accommodation or a work from home arrangement, you really have to be careful, because if that employee was performing all of the essential functions of the job, during the pandemic while they were at home, how can you, really say now that they can't do that because it's required for them to be in the office? Now, one way that employers can tackle that is they have to look at, well, were the employees truly performing all of the essential functions during the pandemic while they were working at home? A lot of employers modified those job duties. They recognized that certain things couldn't be done in the office while we were battling COVID, and so they modified those. But the question employers have to ask themselves is, is there a rational basis? Can I really say that this position is required to be in person? And they need to be very thoughtful about that. The other thing I'm seeing a lot of is accommodations related to commuting to and from the office. And for a long time, courts held that, well, the essential functions of the job are really what happens once you get to the office or once you get to your place of employment. And can you perform those once you're there? We don't really look at the ability to get there or get home at the end of the day. But now we're seeing a little bit of a shift in that across the country. Some courts have held that, especially when in-person attendance is a required essential function of the job, that employers should be a little bit more flexible about accommodations as it relates to commuting. For example, there was a case where individual had a vision disability where it was very difficult for this individual to drive during the daytime, which sounds counterintuitive. Most of us have trouble driving at night, but this individual requested a schedule accommodation to be able to drive at night. And in that case, it wasn't a Tennessee case, but in that case, the court held that it would perhaps be reasonable to look at that schedule accommodation as it related to the commute, as opposed to just something that was going, a particular impediment in the office itself. And so I'm seeing more commuting issues popping up now too.
Hey, Brandon, thank you very much. Now we're going to talk about websites. Gavin, new legislation has come out regarding websites and accessibility. Can you tell us what this new legislation requires?
Yes, I will. And I think before we get to that, I think zooming out, Stephanie had mentioned her, we talked about physical disability with a wheelchair. Brandon just mentioned vision or vision impairment. And I think that's something to think about as disabilities. Is there's physical disabilities, there's vision impairments, there's also hearing, then there's also cognitive, like learning disabilities. And so when you think about a website, sometimes it gets lost because you don't think about how you use a website, right? You just use it. But if someone can't utilize the website because of a cognitive disability or a vision disability or a physical disability, right? That's where the accessibility on your website starts to come in. And that can be as simple as most of us use a mouse, right? Well, if you can't use a mouse, how do you navigate a website? If you are visually, have an impairment and you have to see something on the website to move to use it, what do you do as a user, right? And so a lot of this, all of this actually ties to empathy, right? Just caring about the person who's on the other end of it. So going back to that, this summer, the Department of Justice came out with a rulemaking or announced a rulemaking, and not an attorney, that's him, but basically said, we're going to come out with stricter technical guidelines as it relates to websites. So, websites have needed to be accessible, but for the most part, that accessibility has been the range of the super large, like think eBay, like large companies where it's actually worth basically taking them to court over it to get it fixed or to get damages. What's happening is they're coming out with stricter guidelines that'll make it a lot clearer of when a website is out of compliance and in compliance. Right now, what they use is something called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or the WCAG. And the standard was 2.1. They've actually come out with 2.2 now. And it really talks about what are the guidelines to how a website should be accessible. And the problem is it's interpretive, right? Like most things. So it's not as clear as this is bad, this is good. It is, well, does it work this way? And so what's happening is the DOJ is going to say, hey, it's not been announced yet because the rulemaking ended. It's in the commentary period. And after the comments come out, they will then solidify it. Okay, great. Now what does it look like to be accessible? To make matters a little more confusing, WCAG 2.2 actually just came out, which is actually more mobilely friendly. And that's going to have a different level of understanding. But there are basically 78 success criteria under 2.1. There's an additional 9 under 2.2. And so it just becomes to say, okay, how do we begin to make a site accessible? And it's now what we're seeing is our clients are starting to get essentially letters preemptively from attorneys saying, hey, your site's inaccessible. And you know, we want you to fix it, or even ahead of the rulemaking. And so what we are imagining is going to happen is, or seeing is happening is, as it gets clearer of the, becomes more black and white, it's going to fall down further from the likes of the major companies to companies who maybe didn't even know they needed to be accessible, but they're going to get a letter in the mail that says, hey, we are not happy about this, and it's going to come from an attorney.
Okay, are there some easy things that a company can do right away to move their website towards compliance?
Yeah, I mean, the easy thing to think about when it comes to compliance is there are accessibility guidelines. They're called POUR, perceivable, operable. We won't go through all of them, but the point would be, if someone was red, green colorblind, they might not be able to see a button that uses those colors to navigate, right? They wouldn't know how to move forward on the site. Or contrast, right? A light gray text on a light blue background would probably work fine for at least 75% of the population based on the statistics, but there's going to be a person that you can't see at all. Another one would be an easy one is every image on the internet has the ability to have something called alt text, ALT text, alternative text. Most commonly, it has the alt text is the name of the file. So img2661.jpg, right? Which doesn't, but the point of the alt text is to describe what the image is representing so that someone who can't see it knows what it is, right? So it might, if it was a screenshot of this page, right, it might say, 4 people on a video call, having a discussion. And then someone who can't see that can they'll use a thing called a screen reader, and it'll read it to them and say, this, here's an image and it says this. So it gives the context. So that's an easy thing to do, is go through and add alt text to images. Another common area is thinking about, and this is I would say a rising area, is about cognitive. So would people have trouble operating a website because it's confusing in terms of the layout, right? Does it change page to page? And so you can't get back to where you were without really being able to process it in a different way. Or even, as it relates to video, right? There's a lot of things going on. There's video and there's pop-ups and there's all of this stuff, which kind of like, the bright light scenario, it creates a scenario that makes it hard to navigate or impossible to navigate to someone who might have some sensory piece to that. And so thinking about those kinds of pieces. It also just starts with your users and understanding who's going to come to your website. Whether that's the ADA covers everyone, but you can think about your own population of website users and think, who's coming to our sites, right? If you're a healthcare clinic, we do a lot of healthcare, and your average patient's 70 years old. Well, you can intuit some things that might actually make the site better for someone who's 70, who doesn't necessarily have some of these disabilities, but they may just have, oh man, it's easier to see bigger text than smaller text. So one of the great things that has happened, an alignment with the ruling, is that technology has really come alongside. And so some of these things before that were really hard to really accomplish. You almost had to build two different websites. Now technology has come alongside, and you can create a scenario where you can make some of these changes, where the user can make the changes. And you've probably seen it. There's a little button oftentimes to the side of a website that's got a handicapped icon or some kind of disability icon. You can click that and make adjustments to the site for that user versus making it to the entire site.
Okay. So if a business is unsure if they are compliant, or need to update their website, what should they do to meet
Sure.
the requirements?
Yeah, there's a number of things they could do. There's some online checklists that will walk through some of the requirements. In the sense of this, I'll put it in the chat. We offer a free checker, so we can give you a report. They'll say, hey, these are where you're not compliant, because sometimes it can be technical, right? It might be something that you wouldn't be aware of or even know. And I'll give an example. Peloton recently, the bike company where you watch the screen, Peloton lost a suit because their videos of the live training sessions didn't have closed captioning, right? So, and you might think, well, why is someone who can't hear watching? But that's not the point. The point is that people who couldn't hear it they didn't understand what to do. And on a Peloton, if you've ever done it, you have to know when to twist the knob to make it harder, when to stand up, and all those kind of things. So again, it's kind of it can seem silly at times, but it's not. It's important. These people can't do it. And so your website may have similar things, right? Maybe it's captchas. Maybe there are pieces that you're inadvertently putting steps in front of somebody. And so getting someone else, third party, to look at it can be a helpful. And it could be, if you've got a website company, it could be them to just ask for help to make sure you are in alignment. Like I said, not an attorney, but there could definitely be pieces of this that could cause you financial distress in the future.
And what are some consequences that an organization might experience if they have a website that is not accessible?
Sure. Yeah. So again, not an attorney. That's Brandon down there. But there's actually kind of a two-sided piece of this, right? There's the side of it where you're non-compliant, and the Department of Justice has a viewpoint on that. And then there's a piece where you're non-compliant and a user has an issue with that, right? And so they would then essentially sue you in terminology. And that's happened in some cases. That is, they just want it fixed, right? They're not kind of for humanity, just fix it. But they have to take those steps to make that happen. In most cases, if you lose, you're responsible for all of your attorney's fees, their attorney's fees, plus the cost of fixing it. So it's not going to be inexpensive. And then sometimes there could be punitive damage, like there could be damages. And one of the things that I think is maybe the scariest version of it is that while this is happening, everyone who is being impacted by this could also be filing, right? So it's not just the one person, because it's a website, right? It's, if it was a doorway and the doorway is the wrong size, every person who can't go through that doorway, right? It's same version for your website. Every person who can't, the Peloton example, use the Peloton site at that moment actually has the ability to say, hey, this impacted me too. And so you could think about it, it could easily be certainly tens of thousands of dollars into the millions, depending on the size of the scope and the fix and the people affected. So it's not and the great news is that fixing it's actually relatively inexpensive to the cost of the rest of it.
Okay. I don't see any questions in the chat. If audience members, if you have, I see one.
That's perfect.
Okay. That's your post. You just posted a website for the ADA compliant custom report.
Yeah, so I posted the link. If someone wants to get a report, they can find it there.
So I have a question though. Do you think most websites are revisable without having completely redo them? Can like the handicap button be added so that's not a huge expense for employers?
Yeah, it's a good question. So most websites would have the ability to add, and that's basically a software overlay. And so yes, most websites have the ability to relatively inexpensively get to a level of ADA compliance for that. And that's not, it's got some steps to it, but it's not super complicated. Depending on the nature of the site and the users and everything else, there certainly could be far more extensive changes that would be required and to bring them into a compliance. Like most things, there's going to be some degree of a legal risk question that needs to be asked about. Where's the risk? What needs to be mitigated? And then certainly the size of the organization for set two. The place that we see it often is, or at least in examples, is where there was an example where Rite Aid, they put up a COVID portal, right? So COVID-19 portal to get your testing, and then they were sued for inaccessibility, right? It wasn't ADA compliant, which you think everything's going crazy, but the reality is it still meets the criteria of healthcare, public audience, and it was inaccessible to some version of users. And again, it's the reason I share that example is because they're doing the right thing. They're trying to get people tested. They're trying to make it easy. Everything's moving fast at that time, but it doesn't recuse them from the ability to actually still do it in an ADA compliant way. And so there's probably sites, whether it's parts of your website or pieces of it, that also fulfill the same kind of thing. So that's another thing to check is, what have you launched that maybe was quick and needs a recheck of, oh, we didn't actually add alt text here, or we didn't build this so that the keyboard can navigate the website, which is one of the easy other things, or all the buttons maybe actually are hard to read, and maybe we should reevaluate that.
Okay. I don't see any questions in the chat, but I do want to ask Stephanie, Brandon, and Gavin, any thoughts that you would like to leave with the audience?
I just got a text from somebody who's in the audience saying that the chat is disabled. I don't know if, there may be some questions that just aren't able to get through there. As far as some thoughts on things that I've heard, I can tell that Brandon and Gavin are my partners in ADA land. I've heard some wonderful things expressed today, spot on, when Brandon talked about the interactive process, how important it is. It is critical to all employers, for their sake, under the ADA Title I, to have those job descriptions current. If there's one thing that is beaten into us at every national ADA symposium, is to accommodate an employee, you must first have a current job description. And if you don't, that's going to pose to be a big problem for employer and employee during that interactive process. I love the fact that Gavin mentioned, the ADA website requirements may be huge, they may be daunting, but they're not impossible to achieve. They've been out there. The push was there, BC, as I referred to before COVID, but now the push is really there since we were all forced to basically go virtual for a couple of years. And so the more we do to make gradual steps to be more accessible and more inclusive, and to be on the front end, rather than, what I mean by that is being proactive rather than reactive, will always serve your employers and your companies and your bottom line better than waiting for a complaint or, heaven forbid, that lawsuit.
Brandon, anything you want to leave
Yeah.
with the audience?
Yeah, I will echo what Stephanie said about the job descriptions, and any HR professionals that are in the audience may try and tar and feather me after this, but I would recommend, on an annual basis, audit those job descriptions, because if it's a job description that's been in the file for 10 or 15 years, then there's a good chance that maybe what the employee is actually doing in that same position now is not necessarily what the job description says. And so you just want to make sure that what you have in those job descriptions encompasses what's actually being done rather than just a list of tasks that are pulled from thin air or are obsolete based on the passage of time. And so I would recommend take a look at those on an annual basis, and that may be something you incorporate into annual reviews with employees to make sure that they're actually performing those duties, or are there any additional major duties that aren't listed in your job description that you think we need to add. So that would be a good time to do that. But I echo the importance of that. It's an important first step in the interactive process.
Okay.
And last thing I would add, as a marketer, one of the things that is changing with search engine optimization rapidly is really focusing on how the user impacts and uses your website. And so things that annoy all of us, like pop-ups or sites that are slow, they cause us to go away from a website. And so at a core baseline, making your website more accessible, more ADA friendly will actually influence and impact your own search engine ranking, how you show up in Google. Beyond that, I would task people to think with empathy about your site, right? It's frustrating when your site doesn't work the way it's supposed to, or when you're on a site that doesn't work the way it's supposed to. So think about the people who need to use it. And when you're able to do that, the rest of these things become a little bit clear and more reasonable in the sense that we should do this. One of the things I didn't mention, but I will, is a common place that people have a lot of problem on websites. Everyone has, is filling out a form, right? I mean, just imagine going through a form and it won't submit, it won't submit, it won't submit. And the only thing that tells you that it won't submit is a little red asterisk. And then imagine you are red, green, colorblind, you can't see that, right? Like, so that kind of empathy is like, and it's fixable, right? Just make the asterisk a different color, change the notification. Like it's all doable. But it just commonly falls to just, it's the way it's been done. And so we have to make some changes. So, like I said, we already talked about it, but start with some kind of scanner audit. And then there is money available if your business qualifies to make some of these changes too. So, but start with something, start with some steps, and there are benefits to it.
Okay, Gavin, thank you. I put my email address up in the chat. I apologize to our audience if they're not able to type any questions, so that you're welcome to message me and I'll get the questions out and answers back to you from Stephanie, Brandon, or Gavin. And if we don't have anything else, I'm going to start wrapping this up. Stephanie, Brandon, Gavin, anything else you want to share?
Well, Brandon said earlier, you don't ask me to be brief, and I struggle with that as well. But just
You have time. Go ahead.
some other great observations. Brandon mentioned an accommodation earlier for an employee with some carpal tunnel syndrome issues. And, that is one of the easiest things that we can do as an employer to accommodate an employee. I've done this in the past, and it's simply a matter of talking with that employee and getting from him or her what their absolute needs are and what the barriers are on the job. In this case, it's the typing and the pain and discomfort that causes. So we can purchase an ergonomic keyboard. We can purchase a rising and lowering desk keyboard tray. Sometimes we can even, and on a temporary basis, I suggested that an employee, while we waited on that ergonomic keyboard and desk tray to come, I suggested that he use the text-to-speech feature that's already built in like Word and some of the email programming, and that was a huge relief for the pain and discomfort caused in the hands by typing. There's several in the disability community mantras, if you will, but one thing that I hear every single time I go to training, the national level, is educate and accommodate, or be prepared to litigate. And no offense to my friends who are attorneys, they provide an amazing service to us. But if you can avoid litigation, it's always best. It always comes with a better outcome for your employee, for your customers. And you know, when you think about 1 in 3 Americans has a family member with a disability, think about the amount of potential profit you are skipping past if you have just one little old step to get into your mom and pop shopping spot, or if you have just a couple of minor barriers on your website and I can't shop there, or I can't sign up for a rapid test to be delivered, or things like that. So when the Americans with Disabilities Act is on the forefront, and we plan to be accessible as much as possible, we may naturally find barriers in our own establishments we can't exactly fully overcome. But the Department of Justice and the EEOC expect us to try. And without trying, we're essentially neglecting those obligations. So it's always better to give it a shot. You may fail, you may win beautifully, and you may often, I find, come out with an even better outcome than you had originally planned, just because you included the requirements of the ADA, and you also thought to engage with the disability community. Department of Justice is big on that. You have a new facility you want to put up, you got a new business idea, if at all possible, run that past those who are impacted by accessibility or maybe a lack thereof. You will find that most of the time you will get a better outcome when you include rather than exclude those who live with the need for accessibility.
That's a great idea, to ask someone with disabilities to, what do you think about my store? What do you think about my website? Do you have any problems navigating it? So yes, just getting feedback from your local customers. Stephanie, Brandon, Gavin, I want to thank you for taking the time to share this valuable information with us, with the audience. And I want to again thank our sponsors, PMG Benefits, Higginbotham, Axe Fleet Maintenance, Cook Brothers Homes, Fraley and Schilling, as Smart Bank. And I wish everyone a great day. Thank you so much.